Hi, this tutorial is created by pm-prep35.com. pm-prep35.com is a free PMP training website. Do visit pm-prep35.com for free mock exams, chapter test and tutorials. In this session I am going to cover identify stakeholders process. This process is part of initiating process group and it's part of project stakeholder management knowledge area. The identify stakeholders process is involved with coming up of the stakeholder list. The stakeholder list has the list of key stakeholders for the project, their contact information, their influence on the project, and any other first-hand information that you can get as part of your initiating process. Identify stakeholders process is one of the first processes that a project manager will work on, basically because it falls in the initiating process group, and the only other process part of PMBOK is develop project charter, which is where the project manager is identified. So identify stakeholders is normally followed after the develop project charter process, wherein the project manager sits and finds out who are the important stakeholders for the concerned project. Stakeholders have or people who have vested interest in the outcome of the project, or in other words, they are keenly interested about the project and the impact that it can have on their work. So the stakeholders can have negative or positive influence on the project outcome. So that's where it's necessary to factor in all their interest, influence and power into the project management, so that their interest are taken care, their interest, and they are given importance. So that's where identify stakeholders process is really important. This process is normally followed by the development of the stakeholder management plan. The stakeholder management plan, it takes care that the different strategies to take care of the influence, that negative influence or positive influence that a stakeholder can have. So to manage the different stakeholders is taken care as part of developing the stakeholder management plan. So with that idea, let's quickly walk through the identify stakeholders process. Project stakeholders are individuals, groups or organizations having vested interest in the final outcome of the project. They have a certain amount of interest and involvement in the project. They might positively or negatively impact the project outcome. To ensure project success, it is necessary to identify the key stakeholders early on in the project. It also is necessary to revisit the stakeholder list as the project passes through different phases during its life cycle. So different stakeholders will have a say in different phases of the project life cycle. So for example, when you are developing your end product, you probably would want to take an account of the end users, but initially while you're planning, you want to take a note of the high level senior management. So it depends on the phase you are in, and then get the right stakeholders involved in. So it's better to find out the stakeholders early in the project life cycle, but then as you get into the different phases, it's necessary to involve them and get their buy-in for the project to be successful. It is also necessary to classify stakeholders according to their power and project interest levels, so that key project communications can reach them and their support is sought at necessary points. So when you talk about power, influence and all that, it's necessary to look at the different grids normally used to classify the stakeholders. So there is a power interest grid. The power interest grid plots the power in the y-axis and the interest in the x-axis. So based on that, you can plot your different stakeholders in different quarters, as you can see. So if the stakeholder is high power and has high interest, then you need to manage them closely because they fall in the fourth quarter in the top. So the stakeholders are classified basically as a monitor, wherein they have low power and low interest. They have minimum effort to be monitored. Then if they have low power but then high interest, they should be kept informed. If they have high power and low interest, they should be kept satisfied. If they have high power and high influence, high interest, then they should be managed closely. So this is the power interest grid. Similarly, you have power influence grid, wherein you have the power in the y-axis and the influence in the x-axis. This also has the same classification as the power interest grid. Then you have the influence impact grid. What impact, based on the influence that the stakeholder can have, what impact you can have on the project objectives. So that is also another grid. So based on the project and the requirement or the context, you develop different grids to see which stakeholders are the key and to keep them informed about different project decisions. Then you have the salience model. The salience model is more concerned about, what kind of stakeholders are involved. So you, based on the power, urgency of information, and then the legitimacy, you can classify stakeholders as dormant, discretionary, demanding, dominant, dangerous, dependent, definitive, or non-stakeholder. So there are different levels. So the highly people who need to be taken care about communications, or the dormant and the discretionary and the demanding stakeholders. So these are different techniques that are used to come up with the stakeholder list. So with that idea, just let's walk through the remaining points. Customer sponsors project team, and performing organization, seller are all examples of stakeholders. So let's get into the inputs for this particular process. The main input is the project charter, because it's one of the first documents which has the high stakeholder list. This has the high level details, including the initial list of stakeholders useful in identify the complete project stakeholder list. So the project charter has the high level stakeholder list, but then the identify stakeholders process is the project manager's view of who are the important stakeholders in the process, what is their power, influence, and all that. So the next important input is procurement document. You need to understand what this procurement document means here in this context. If the project is as a result of procurement from an external organization, so that's where the procurement documents are important. Like for example, an SOW might be issued by, or a contract might be issued by the organization that wants to get the project done. So that's where the procurement documents are really important. You can look at the procurement documents and find out who are the key stakeholders, who is issuing it from the concerned organization, and you can easily make out who are the key stakeholders, who has the power to influence things in the the performing organization. So procurement documents in this context, if you are performing the project as part of a contract, then that's where the procurement documents are really important. So apart from this, basically, because it's one of the initiating process, enterprise environmental factors, organizational process assets are important input. If the project involves legal approvals on its government base, then enterprise environmental factors play a key role in deciding the project function. Organizational process assets, like any other process, knowledge, templates, or experience gained from previous similar projects regarding stakeholders are useful to this process. Example, stakeholder register template. Tools and techniques. Stakeholder analysis is one of the technique that you do. Deciding on stakeholder influence, power, and involvement needs detailed analysis of organization structure and organization culture and working style. The proper analysis will decide on project success. The following are some of the classification models. So when you do stakeholder analysis, you analyze the influence, impact, impact to the change, impact to the project, impact to the objectives, power, interest, and all that, and you plot the different grids. So power interest grid, a graphing methodology that plots the stakeholder power against his interest based on what quadrant the stakeholder falls. Project decisions like involvement or sign off can be made. Power influence grid, a graphing methodology that plots the stakeholder power against his influence, useful in influencing the organization at right points like making. So we saw what are these grids. So you have the power influence grid here and the power interest grid, based on which you can categorize different stakeholders. So these can be used based on different project context and scenario. Then you have the influence impact grid. So these are all part of stakeholder analysis that you do. So you plot the different grids and find out which squatter the stakeholder falls in. Then you have the salience model that we saw. In this, as part of this process, you also do expert judgment. Expert judgment is useful in finding out who are the key stakeholders. Seeking involvement from external managers or other organization units involved in similar project situations helps in getting expert judgment. Then you do meetings. As part of all initiating planning process, you have meetings to find out extra information. So meetings with different stakeholders to understand their interest and involvement apart from what role they play in the project or the organization, that's what you do as part of meetings. The stakeholder register has the list of stakeholders, name, address along with their contact information, designation, their interest and involvement levels, stakeholder classification like internal, external, buyer or seller relevant to the project. So if you look at a stakeholder template, it looks like this, wherein you have the name of the stakeholder as one of the columns, position of the stakeholder in the organization, performing organization. So then the role of the stakeholder, contact information, what are their requirements is another column. Then expectations of the stakeholder, what influence they can have on the project. Then the classification, whether they are internal, external and all that. So those things, and anything more than this, like the power, if you want to add after you put your grid, that can also be added to this particular stakeholder register. So you normally tailor this template based on what is relevant to your project. So this is the rough stakeholder register, which has main columns or your stakeholder name, contact information, position and the role in the organization, and you add on extra information like the classification, which might be internal stakeholder, which external stakeholder or a seller, and all those information. You because you would add more information if it is necessary for your particular project. So stakeholder register is the output of this particular project. So that's about this particular process called identify stakeholder process. The identify stakeholder process is more concerned about finding out the stakeholder list, their role, their responsibilities, their influence on the project, their categorization or the classification, and what are their requirements. As you see in the initiating or the initial phase of the project, that's what gets documented as part of the stakeholder register. Based on this, you'll plan strategies as to how to handle them, because some of them might be a negative stakeholder, so you want to convince them to get your buy-in for your project. So that's part of your stakeholder management process. So that's all about identify stakeholders process. Do visit pm-prep35.com to access other process tutorials, mock exams, chapter and tests. Thank you.